So I want to talk to you about 4 key questions that are going to frame what we know about psychotherapy and also things that are going to help you understand how our course is organized. The first one is, does change occur in psychotherapy, or is psychotherapy effective? The second is, what is the target of our interventions? The third is, how do we explain how intervention X leads to change? And then the fourth is, are there general principles of change that can be extracted from our psychotherapy literature? One note here is when we talk about interventions, we may be referring to a specific thing we do in treatment. So I may be trying to engage in exposure with my client, or we could be talking about a package of interventions. So we could package a whole bunch of interventions, including exposure, into a cognitive behavioral treatment of social phobia, for example. Let's look at each of these a little bit more specifically. So the first question is, does change occur and is therapy effective? As you'll read about, learn about, talk about, this is one of the primary questions that plagued psychotherapy when it came into the mainstream. And the question was, we've been doing psychotherapy for a while, but there was no real great evidence to suggest that it was actually effective. So in opposition to that challenge, we saw a number of psychotherapists looking at psychotherapy outcome studies and conducting, more specifically, outcome studies. And as we'll learn about, the kind of gold standard of any outcome study is a randomized control trial. It's not the only way to evaluate psychotherapy outcome and whether or not psychotherapy is effective, but it still tends to be the gold standard. The second question that we'll look at over the course of this semester is, what is the target of our interventions? And this slide is actually particularly important because it provides a foundation of how our course is organized. So what I've done is, instead of going through different theories, let's talk about theory X or treatment approach X or Y or Z, what I've done is to say, let's look at the different things we may target during our intervention. And I've abstracted from the literature 7 of those that I consider to be the most central. And those include relational, cognitive, behavioral, interpersonal, emotional, motivational, or cultural factors. And the way you want to think about this is, in any given session, in any given treatment that I'm doing, what is the thing I'm attempting to change? And your intervention strategy, how you evaluate outcomes, how you look at and conceptualize what you're doing, are all going to be focused through that particular frame or that particular target. Our third question then, how do we explain how intervention X leads to change? This is probably the most complex of the questions that we have. We know, not to, bury the lead, but we know that our interventions are effective. We know that they target different relational or different areas. What we know a whole lot less about is why those particular interventions are effective. This type of research when psychotherapists talk about this, they often talk about either principles or mechanisms or processes of change. And they also talk about moderators of change. So if I am person A, does this particular thing work differently for me than it would be for person B? Whatever defines person A or B in that particular scenario, that's a moderator. So when I talk over the course of the semester about principles of change, mechanisms of change, processes of change, this is what we're talking about, is how do we understand what psychotherapy is and what makes it effective. I've provided a definition of a mechanism of change and a moderator at the bottom of the slide. I'm not going to read those to you. You can look at those on your own time here. And then our final question is, are there general principles of change that can be extracted from our psychotherapy literature? So this is our principles of change. So you'll hear me refer to principles of change over the course of the semester. What this means is when I look at all of what we know, is there a general principle that I can abstract? So for example, um, having a good therapeutic relationship with another person will likely make psychotherapy more effective. That would be a general principle of change. If we go back to, I don't know if I can do this. Nope, I can't do that, sorry. If we go back to our previous slide, if we're talking about mechanisms, the mechanism might explain why. So the principle would say, look, a good relationship is important. It helps produce change. The mechanism would be, why does that happen? What exactly is occurring if I have a good relationship with another person? We'll talk a lot more about these questions as we go through the semester. My goal here is to really kind of get you acclimated to what they are and what you can expect. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't throw in a little research methods here, and I'm going to do this briefly. Questions 3 and 4, the ones that look at mechanisms or principles of change, are generally explored using what we consider to be process outcome-oriented studies. So I'm looking at different processes, what's going on in the therapeutic encounter, and I'm trying to link those to various outcomes in the literature. And these are in contrast to outcome or efficacy studies, which is really the first question that we talked about. Outcome efficacy studies simply simply answer this question of, is this effective? Is this better than nothing? Is it better than a control? That's outcome efficacy. And again, you can start to hopefully see how these go together. I can have an outcome and efficacy study that says treatment A is better than no treatment or better than a treatment control. And you go, that's great. I should do treatment A. But the question becomes, why is treatment A effective? And that's where process outcome studies come in. They look at the process of what happens within treatment A to better understand the things that make that treatment effective. And as we'll learn, this may lead to certain times where we go, look, can I get rid of part A and B of that treatment? And is it still as effective? Or do I need all elements of that treatment in order for things to be effective? I probably jumped the shark a little bit there. That's a little bit of a higher level complexity that you don't need to be at right now, but just to make a prelude to what's to come. One thing I'll point out before I close this, remember in your reading you read about the difference between efficacy and effectiveness studies. I'll just leave this hanging out there, and we'll come back and talk about that in class to see if you can kind of explain to me what the difference between an efficacy study and an effectiveness study is, because that's also important when we talk about research methods and understanding the psychotherapy research literature.